May peace be upon all of us. My name is Fahrul Rinaldi. On the road towards the opening of UIII September this year, we are delighted to present you a series of international webinars, all of which will appease you with captivating topics and introduce you with several brilliant speakers of international repute. Our utmost respect for all of the speakers in our previous webinars, where we had Professor Ahmed T. Kuru, Professor Abdullahi Ahmed An-Naim, Professor Tim Lindsay, Professor Muhammad Azmi Omar, and Professor Muhammad Rugi, all phenomenal in their expertise and their respective approaches. Today, for our 6th international webinar series, we are pleased to invite Professor Abdullah Sahin from the University of Warwick as our guest speaker, who will present why education fails to transform global Muslim societies in the modern world, an imperative for the paradigm shift. This topic will explain the issue Muslim societies are facing in this modern, globalized era, particularly how education is failing to transform the mindset of its community. Instead of providing the solution to this problem, we will view this as an opportunity to analyze the paradigm shift. This webinar is raised to welcome and discuss some of the causes behind the failures and the crucial need for the paradigm shift. All participants may use the Q&A feature on Zoom to ask questions. All blessed panelists and participants, UIII is a newly established legal entity state international university founded in 2016 upon presidential regulation and operates under the administration of the Ministry of Religious Affairs. For a brief introduction about the university, I would like to invite you to watch the UIII profile video.
Universitas Islam Internasional Indonesia adalah graduate school. Universitas Islam bertaraf internasional menjadi pusat pengkajian kebudayaan Islam yang modern, toleran, dan berkemajuan.
Secara fisik, kampus ini didesain sebagai kampus yang ikonik, yang futuristik, dan diharapkan inilah salah satu model kampus dengan arsitektur tropikal. Kita harapkan bahwa para mahasiswa Sivitas Akademika itu nantinya menikmati suasana kampus yang hijau, yang berbuah, kemudian mereka juga bisa olahraga pagi, sore, naik sepeda dari asrama ke fakultas, ke library, ke masjid. Kampus ini kita harapkan betul-betul sebagai satu center for the epistemic community, pusat dari masyarakat ilmiah. Mereka ke sini betul-betul fokus untuk studi. Di samping Indonesia sebagai laboratorium yang hidup, pengalaman kita berdemokrasi, pengalaman bagaimana mendirikan republik ini, dan ini bukan Islamic State, kita juga menjaga kebinekaan. Hal-hal seperti ini kan unik sekali. Nah, bagaimana ini bisa kita kemas dalam satu format akademik dan budaya, kemudian menjadi semacam konsumsi intelektual bagi masyarakat intelektual Indonesia dan juga bagi masyarakat luar yang datang ke sini. Karena sebuah universitas itu mesti ada, yaitu program humaniora, ilmu sosial, sains, di samping juga studi keagamaan. Dengan adanya beberapa tenaga ahli dari dalam luar negeri, mereka itu tidak saja memberi kuliah bagi mahasiswa dalam kelas, tapi kita harapkan mereka juga bisa diambil manfaatnya dan memberi manfaat pada komunitas di luar kampus ini. Dengan demikian, kampus ini tidak saja dimiliki oleh masyarakat Indonesia, kita harapkan kampus ini dimiliki juga oleh dunia Islam. Keislaman yang berkembang dan yang kita kembangkan itu keislaman yang terkoneksi, terbuka, berdialog dengan ilmu-ilmu yang lain. Sekarang bagaimana kampus ini juga menyambung perkembangan sejarah yang agak terputus, satu bangunan ilmu yang sudah terpisahkan, yang sudah terdistorsi, yang termiskinkan. Kampus Islam itu tidak hanya Islamic Studies sesungguhnya, tapi juga mencakup berbagai ilmu-ilmu yang lain.
Dari Universitas Islam Internasional Indonesia akan lahir intelektual yang memahami persoalan kehidupan global, menghadirkan solusi yang efektif dan bermanfaat untuk semesta. Rahmatan lil alamin.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed the brief visual about our new campus. Now, let us begin this webinar by inviting Professor Komarudin Hidayat to deliver his welcoming speech.
Oh, it's my turn. Okay, thank you. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I would like first welcome my dear friend, Dr. Abdullah Sahin from University of Warwick. And thank you very much for being the speaker for this text seminar. Hoskal Dinis, Indonesia. The Indonesian International Islam University, UIII, now we have currently have 4 faculties: Faculty of Islamic Studies, Faculty of Social Sciences, Faculty of Economic and Business, and Faculty of Education. It is important to let you know briefly, since we'll start soonly in this September. UIII will start teaching and learning in September 2021. With its faculty consists of 25 master students who come from Indonesia and abroad, such as Philippines, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Zambia, Zanzibar, Afghanistan, and Morocco, and will have doctorate student next semester, that is 20 and 22. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining this seminar. It is our 6th seminar, and today we'll be talking about education. When we look at Islam history, Islam reached the golden age between 8th and 13th century. However, most Muslim majority countries in Asia and Africa now are generally left behind other countries in Australia, Europe, and America. To achieve what Muslims have achieved during the golden age, we need to find out the characteristic of this age. For example, Muslims at the time were being open to knowledge from anywhere, especially from Greek philosophy, not limited to Islamic religious knowledge. They using reason to develop new knowledge based on the existing knowledge, and also the state support for Muslim intellectual dynamic, including the building of Baitul Hikmah, or the House of Wisdom, which is so famous in Islam history, where there was many books were collected. In addition, we also need to learn why Muslim intellectual dynamic were declining after the 13th century, while most Western countries were progressing up until today. Looking back at the history, we can know that the West was learning actually and continuing Islamic tradition of using reason to develop new knowledge from the existing knowledge. For example, in the area of medicine, many Western scholars developed the knowledge from Avicenna. And in the area of philosophy and ethics, they developed knowledge from Averroes. And now we always listen and hear about algorithm. It is actually derived from al-Khawarizmi, and now in the West they call algorithm. This tradition of developing new knowledge based on the existing knowledge has been continued up until now in the West, making the countries are progressing well, leaving Muslim majority countries left behind. Education, I believe, to be one of the important determinants for the progress of society. As there is famous proverb from Imam Shafi'i, "Man arada dunya wa alaihi bil ilmi, wa man arada al akhirah fa alaihi bil ilmi, wa man aradahuma fa alaihi bil ilmi." So science, knowledge is very important to achieve success and happiness both in dunya wal akhirah. It is through education, well, that we can seek knowledge in a more systemic and meaningful way. Similarly, on the importance of education, let me also mention the quote from William Fulbright. Yeah, it is also very popular. Education is slow moving, but powerful force. We have already had educational system, but what is wrong with our education that make us fail to transform global Muslim society? This is one of the basic questions that we seek to answer in this webinar. And I hope we can have productive intellectual exercise that we can follow up within this newly established Faculty of Education that UIII we are involved. And thank you, my dear friend Abdullah Sahin, that you have been with us. And again, thank you that you already ready to be our professor in our new university. Thank you very much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Professor, for your speech. We can now continue to the webinar session. I would like to invite Professor Nina Nurmila, the Dean of the Faculty of Education, to chair this session.
Thank you very much, Fahrul. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin wassalatu wassalamu ala Muhammadin sayyidil mursalin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatam min lisani yafqahu qawli. Amma ba'du. Honorable Rector Professor Dr. Komarudin Hidayat, Vice Rectors Dr. Bahrul Hayat, Professor Jamhari Ma'ruf, and Dr. Dadang Mulyawan, my friend Dr. Fuad Jabali, happy to see you again here, and my fellow deans, Professor Dian Masita, Professor Nur Haidi, and Dr. Philips Vermonte, all IIIU staffs, our new student of IIIU, and all the audiences. Thank you very much for coming to join this webinar. So this is the 6th series of webinar at the Indonesian International Islamic University, or we call it IIIU, and the first one in the Faculty of Education under the term, Why Education Fails to Transform Global Muslim Societies in the Modern World, an imperative for paradigm shift. So I would like to firstly introduce myself. I am Nina Nurmila. I am the newly appointed Dean of Faculty of Education. I would like to thank IIIU for this trust, and I hope I can do the job well as all of you, the Rector, the Vice Rector, and others expect. Before presentation of our main speakers, Professor Abdullah Sahin, let me introduce who is our speaker today. Dr. Abdullah Sahin is the holder of UK's first leadership post in Islamic education at the Department of Education Studies, University of Warwick. Dr. Sahin comes from Islamic Studies, Education, and Social Science background. His work explored educational reform at the intersection of religion, gender, and politics within diverse Muslim majority and minority societies. Dr. Sahin works has contributed to the establishment of Islamic education as interdisciplinary field of scholarship, empirical inquiry, imaginative activism, and professional development. He has developed UK's first recognized master level degree program on Islamic education studies, contributing to the efforts to decolonize the university curriculum and facilitate critical dialogue between Western and Islamic approach to education. Dr. Sahin has numerous publications on comparative studies of values in higher education. His research advocates educational innovation and the revival of transformative philosophies of education in Muslim tradition. He has taught at the universities of Birmingham, Aberdeen, and the Gulf University for Science and Technology in Kuwait. He served as a visiting professor at IIIS Paris. Dr. Sahin is also the author of the critically acclaimed book, New Direction in Islamic Education, Pedagogy, and Identity Formation, which was published in 2015. And I saw that many writers in the journal have reviewed positively about this publication. He is a member of International Seminar on Religious Education and Values and UII's Future Leaders Fellowship Peer Review College. I'm glad also to inform you that Dr. Sahin will be the visiting professor at the Faculty of Education here in our campus at UIII, beginning this semester, next semester, which will begin on the 27th September 2021. So without further ado, I would like to give the forum to Dr. Sahin. Dr. Abdullah Sahin, the time is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Nina. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi ala din al-Islam wa tawfiq al-Iman wa salatu wa salamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. I'm really honored to be invited back to contribute to this innovative, exciting new development, UIIU. I was privileged to be part of the original planning team and advisory committee a couple of years ago. I'm so excited to see that all of these efforts now have come to fruition, alhamdulillah, and here we have the very first academic year launched, will be launched soon, inshallah. And I'm most honored to be invited to make further contributions to the teaching and research culture, particularly within the Faculty of Education. And this is a really great honor, as I mentioned. And I'd like to thank you to Professor Kamaruddin, Professor Jamhari, and Bahar Hayat, and many other colleagues, Professor Fuad, for their kind, really, recognition of my work and its relevance to this new initiative. So I believe I have half an hour. We have raised a very provocative question. What I would like to present, and we have agreed with the moderator, Professor Nina, that I will spend half an hour presenting via PowerPoint. Apologies, it was prepared a bit hastily. Professor Jamhari and I discussed like 10 days ago or something. So I put together hastily something for you. I hope, inshallah, it will meet your expectations. And I obviously look forward to the question and discussion, which is the most important part of these gatherings. Can I just check whether my screen is visible, Professor Nina?
Not yet.
So I need to share my screen. Is it visible now?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, is it visible, isn't it?
Yes.
Great. So our key question is why education fails to transform global Muslim societies in the modern world, and an imperative for paradigm shift. In order to really engage with this complex question, we need to a little bit look at the wider picture. So why is it that there is this misfunctioning of education in modern Muslim polities? So if you look at the wider picture, we have to recognize some contextual historical dynamics at play. So we have modern Muslim majority societies that are quite diverse. The way in which, let us look at the wider principle of organization, which is political, that a political organization itself is very complex. We have Islamic states, we have secular states with a Muslim majority, just like Indonesia, for example. So this diversity of political framing is an important dynamic to bear in mind when it comes to understand how education functions or doesn't function. We have another dynamic that we should face. Muslim population, global Muslim population, continuously is growing. Recent research estimates that this growth is slightly slowing, but still at the pace of twice the rate of non-Muslim population. So by 2050, the expectations are we'll have almost 30% of the globe to be Muslims. So we have a kind of expanding population, and let's emphasize that this population, although there are some aging trends in different parts of the Islamic world, but still compared to the rest of the world, it's a very young population. The median age is 20s, basically mid-20s. So we have a very young population that we need to bear in mind to cater for their needs, particularly educationally. At the same time, we have a dynamic, we have a historical fact that Muslim societies have obviously are recipients of traditions of Islam. Usually this is called Islamic faith. That means Islam has informed at different degrees, flavoring of making up of these societies. And this Islam has been expressed within the indigenous cultural realities of these contemporary Muslim societies. Some of these legacies, we must admit, are quite imperial. So obviously Muslims have, as we just heard in the beginning of opening speech, they used to be quite dominant in terms of world politics and science, knowledge production, but also politically, we have inherited imperial Islamic structures that are with us today. Although no longer Islam represents a political power, but nevertheless, our imagined past is shaped by this imperial legacy. But also we have civic, spiritual, artistic legacies to bear in mind. So Islam obviously has also been an integral part of responses and reactions to the fact of colonialism, which is the story of 18th, 19th century onwards, early 20s. So Islam has been part of post-colonial process of modernization attempts, globalization force. All of these processes have sadly, mostly it seems to be produced highly reified articulations of Islam. By reified, I mean quite stagnant, ideologically driven readings of Islam, because these Muslim communities worldwide had to defend to an invading colonial power. In between, Islam gets reinterpreted and it loses, sadly, most of its civic creative dimensions. At least this is one reading. So therefore, this is a story of Islamism, if obviously those of who are following the political Islam would know. So the encounter with modernity, the Western modernity, let us say, have opened up experiments with Western style secular nation building, but nevertheless, we don't really have many success stories. Not only Islam has been reduced largely to a reified structure, but we don't have fully functioning secular Islamic states. So the fact is we have to acknowledge we don't really have Islamic modernities. That means Islamic society is interpreting, appropriating modernization within their own cultural context, capable of producing Islamic democratic socio-political cultures. Now, these are obviously some principles that I would like to share with you, which is telling us how complex it is when we look at the contemporary Muslim world, particularly if you want to tease out the role of education in all of this. Because education as an applied really concept, that applied field has links with all of these developments, as we will see. But the sad state of affairs are currently, we really are struggling to articulate a kind of a mature Islam in the modern world, and also that being part of the wider Islamic democratic socio-political cultural emergence, which is all being hindered. We don't much have this. So haven't people, kind of recognize the importance of education in all of this complex socio-cultural political unfolding, and why they haven't utilized education space? Of course they did. And any of you are familiar with the 19th and early 20th century reform movements, you will all look at, you all recognize the fact that education has been at the very forefront of these reform projects. Some obviously trying to replicate Western models, some trying to replicate the imagined old Islamic educational models. And therefore, education was at the forefront of many of these reform projects. Now, we don't have time to analyze this very important, reform projects and why, and they have overall failed, or which areas they were successful, which areas they were not. That's a journey will take us to different parts of Islamic world. But overall, we could say that if you look at today, and if you take only one yardstick, that is educational attainment, that means access to education as a principle, a criteria. Even today, at the dawn of 21st century, yes, compared to 20th century, we have evidence that as a result of rapid modernization, huge investment in education infrastructure, we have access to education seems to have been widened. But still, for example, there is a huge gender gap. More than 4 in 10 of Muslim women, for example, worldwide, have no formal schooling. Almost only 6% of Muslim women today, estimates telling us, have access to higher education. So despite the fact that, because of modernization, we have now education opened up, available to populations, but this access seems to be still hindered with some of the other factors like gender, for example. Now, if you take some other yardsticks, which are a little bit random but quite telling, for example, I don't know you're aware, there is this Global Innovation Index rankings. Every year has been, they publish this. I'm wary of ranking models because they could be quite subjective. But this particular one, which came just before the pandemic hit the whole world, we have within this global ranking of global innovative thinking, only 11 Muslim countries out of 80 countries make to the top 100. That means even in economic infrastructure, there isn't really much success story, sadly. Again, between 2006 and 15, if you look at much more to the research and education sector, just generic education, we can only have the statistics telling us just only 6% of published cited papers from Islamic universities, which tells us the knowledge production is not quite really there. So Organization of Islamic, this Organization of Islamic Cooperation publishes every year statistics. There are some improvements, but overall, this particular research output is so low, you can only compare to South Africa, for example, which on its own has contribution of research output across all of the universities, almost 10%, which tells us, sadly, education reforms haven't quite worked out to establish a new knowledge producing, generating, research-based educational university enterprise. So there is this decline in quality of research output, observing research ethics, for example, and there isn't really much evidence how these educational institutions are impacting on the local or global communities. Finally, you might be also aware of this reality that we've been entering into what has been called as the fourth industrial revolution, i.e. the digital skills entitlement, that all governments across the world now are preparing their educational system to respond to this digital gap, these digital skills, because we're moving on to this new, basically industrial revolution formed around social media, digital skills network. So we are not sure really how Islamic countries are actually preparing their young people to respond to this growing need, because this is going to impact on having access to job markets, which are all requiring this kind of digital skills, for example. So the fair conclusion would be education. This is so far, I'm not making any distinction between Islamic or secular education. We are just looking at the educational phenomena, reality across Islamic world. So education doesn't appear to be, in its general sense, transform Muslim communities or help them to reinvent themselves. The fact is, there is this still persisting lack of social mobility, for example, because the graduates of universities are usually lacking these skills that are important for their success into job market. There is this huge phenomenon unfolding of urbanization, but it's mismanaged. It is environmental impact, lack of sustainable development. Overall, it has a huge impact on how these societies function. And of course, worst of all, sadly, marginalization of human rights, human dignity, gender injustice, and finally, the rise of religious extremism, conflicts, tensions, and lack of tolerance, which appears to be quite widespread, sadly, across the Islamic world. I'm not simply stigmatizing Islamic world, but these are undeniable, appears to be facts when you look at, the Islamic world and from the lenses of education. So if we focus our analysis a little bit more onto social sciences and humanities, it appears the available data is telling us these particular social sciences and humanities are really worse in terms of new knowledge generation and facilitating positive social change in Muslim societies. For example, a recent study, which is focused exclusively on the Arab context, 2015, Arab Social Science Monitor Database, they found out actually most of the universities in the Arab world, for example, have got departments of economics. They looked at social sciences faculties, for example, anthropology, the science of human study. It only accounts for 2% of the faculties. And research centers on education and humanities, only 4%. So this tells us the way in which higher education is framed, sadly, it is not really going to produce most desired, most important knowledge of how societies work, how do we respond to the social problems. So that isn't really humanities and social science literate societies, because the fact that university organization excludes them. And when they looked at further how this even science-focused university specialism work, they found that almost 80% of time is spent on teaching, little time for engaging with research, and of course, creating new research. So if you look at the second published data, I mean, these are all terribly, sadly, we don't have much data, empirical data, but these are drawing a picture for us. The second data came out of 2015 exercise called Science at Universities in the Muslim World. And the opening article actually complains immediately, because based on what they found, that even science education seems to be not working. And they are making this observation that science curriculum is quite narrow. It has a binary disciplinary focus. Students are forced into science, make a choice between science and 9 science streams. No liberal arts education, humanities, social science. There is pedagogic rigidity, the way in which teaching and learning is organized. And of course, most crucially, lack of fostering an educational culture of inquiry, questioning. In fact, this report says, in order to science education to succeed, we need to have fully functioning, proper, effective social science and humanities universities first, which is a very interesting admission, because people assume that science could be simply replicated from the West and you could reproduce. They don't realize scientific attitude itself requires an open educational reflective culture. So I thought this is a really telling report, and I advise you to go and read in detail, because they're all available on the website. Now, if we zoom in, since we are using Zoom, if you look at the academic study of Islam, particularly at the undergraduate and the graduate levels, here, unfortunately, I couldn't find, or maybe there isn't really much data or studies on how Islamic studies operate across higher education in the Islamic world. And this is generic Islamic universities, not simply Islamic, but generic universities. But we know that most of these programs, because the way in which they are framed based on the Western higher education models, they are really fall under the confessional model of theological or religious studies framework. And this curriculum is dominated by ahistorical, textual, transmission, instruction-centered pedagogies that do not seem to be equipping young Muslims to intelligently engage with their faith heritage, develop contextual understandings of Islam in the modern world. And reasons for this is because the curriculum is quite narrow. It focuses on transmission of classical Islamic sciences. And bear in mind, I'm not talking about madrasas or pasantrans or Darul Ulooms. I'm talking about actually the Islamic studies departments that are set up modeling Western universities. Obviously, you can make an analogy as to what is going on within the Darul Uloom, the traditional Islamic seminaries, madrasas. Obviously, they are much more complex and much more transmission centered. And this curriculum sadly excludes the crucial method of historical critical thinking, open inquiry, which is quite vital even to engage with Muslim textual and intellectual heritage. If you don't have these tools, really there is no way you can engage this text. You will only memorize and pass on. This is what is happening, but you will not in between transform the learner. Hence, of course, it is very rare to see philosophy, psychology, or sociology of religion to be part of Islamic studies curriculum. And of course, without social science component, there isn't really much interest into empirical research competence development. So if you don't have empirical practical theology, that means there is not much interest in exploring problems of living Islam across global Muslim communities. So if you don't have a bit of social science skill set, you wouldn't be able to really look at how living Islam actually is functioning. You always look at history and you look at, in a sense, textually, but you wouldn't be recognizing within your even theological reflection, you should have an empirical dimension, because after all, these are values, teachings that are lived out every day. And you can only understand this, discern this, if you enable students to have social science empirical research skills. So we don't have really practical or what we call even empirical theologies across Islamic world. Now, if we slightly more make our analysis focus on particularly modern Islamic ethos universities, and these could be classified national, private, and international framings. They all obviously came out, it is a very rapidly expanding sector. They came out as a response to post-colonial struggle and reaction, let us say, beginning with 20th century, and the main idea was to resist Western secular liberal education. So they all came out as part of global Islamic revival movements and networks. And this is very natural, obviously, but this is a reality. For example, the very first probably fully functioning such university came from India, another secular state with huge Islamic population. Aligarh Muslim University in 1920s, for example, originally Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College of 1875. You can look at Islamic University of Medina, which goes back to 1960s. But most important impetus came from Asia Pacific, the Southeast Asia context. That is the International Islamic Universities set up after 1977 First World Conference on Islamic Education. And then we have these international Islamic universities in Malaysia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and they're all with us today. So we have more than 15 conferences subsequently looking at curricula, pedagogy, how these universities could improve. But sadly, we don't have really much evidence, empirical evidence, that these universities have actually delivered what they were really set up for. So it is obviously difficult to pass any judgment, but we don't have empirical data suggesting that they've actually transformed as they were planning originally Islamic societies. But we can, again, I mean, we don't want to take this ranking as a kind of important criteria, but still world rankings are with us today. And you can look at the top 500 ranking. None of these make to the top 500. And we only have probably within the first 300 some universities in the Islamic world. Right. So, and this is maybe, I don't know whether you are able to see, probably it's visible now. Another way of looking at how education functions is to look at these are kind of micro level analysis dynamics, but we also have to look at the individual level how education is functioning, how various types of educational activities forming character, forming identities. So that has been one of my really research interests, that when I began to look at education and religion and identity formation, I developed a model. You're welcome to read in the book, and we'll have the references in the end. I wanted to look at the kind of micro level working out of education in different Islamic societies, majority and minority. So we have a kind of a Muslim subjectivity or Muslim agency research model that I developed, which looks at some of the theoretical models that developed in this area, and it brings together some complex theories like post-foundational phenomenology, critical theory, developmental psychology, personal construct psychology, and Islamic psychology. I know these are very abstract to you now, but don't worry. I mean, it's just telling you that this theory, although it looks very simple, it has a very complex theoretical underpinnings that you can later on go and examine. The theory is based on a simple idea that all of our activities shape who we are, and these are developmental, and you can actually identify the kind of psychological formation of identity by looking at the continuum of exploration and commitment. So typically in social psychology, we say there is an identity if somebody is identifying with certain values. So that commitment to certain values tells us presence of identity. But social psychologists are telling us that this presence of identity may not necessarily be healthy to the overall mental health, personal development of the individual. Because this identification, this commitment, if it has not undergone with a process of exploration, discussion, inquiry, it could actually create foreclosed mindsets, which is rigid mindsets. So there will be, in our Islamic terminology, we could say taqlidi-based identity formation. Taqlid not in the legal sense, but in the sense of simply having, following a certain set of criteria, customs, without having an awareness attached to it. And the idea is, if you have an educational system that is only encouraging foreclosed identity formation, the chances are young people will not develop confidence, skills to be creative, innovative, and engage with the problems. And that requires education as a kind of a moratorium to be a space for young people to experiment, to raise questions, to find their own voices. So sadly, we have the data from both Muslim majority and minority context. We don't seem to actually have any evidence that Islamic education practices, generic practices, are fostering exploratory type of identities. It is other way around. And this is a big concern at the micro level. Okay, now let's come back to our kind of summary of some of what I have just said. So we have malfunctioning, at least not fully functioning educational systems, and we have Islamic societies across the globe are really struggling to reinvent themselves. So this is a social reality. We can summarize this by saying that from an educational prism, that there's a persisting educational challenge in Muslim minority majority communities, because education in its Islamic and secular applications appear not to be acting as a transformational catalyst, but producing either dual mindsets or foreclosed identities. Now, that is our given reality of, sadly, helplessness overall. But historical reality, as we have just heard from Professor Kamaruddin at the very start of this seminar, we also know that Islam transformed in 7th century society that survived late antique world. So education must have been a transformative force in the early Islamic societies. Otherwise, you wouldn't have Islamic science, the golden age between 8th and 13th centuries, all this creativity of science, philosophy, integrating knowledge systems from India to Greeks, confidence in Islamic epistemology, and indeed having early versions of empirical basis of Islamic epistemology, that is medicine, science, astronomy. So clearly Islam must have transformative educational force system. So the question is, how do we make sense of this dissonance? Because there's this similarity. There is a reality of our today of helplessness, and there is historical reality of transformation. That is usually called by psychologists experiencing cognitive dissonance. That we're perplexed. We don't know where to now move on. And usually this kind of dissonance, puts human imagination to forecast some sort of messianic redeemers or people coming, magically transforming society. This is called messianic eschatology, if those of you are interested in theology. And of course, you expect somebody to come in and change everything for you. But this is really not the practical way. The idea would be, how do we discern and reconnect with traditions of transformative educational practice, philosophy, idea, vision in Islam to guide us today? So this is where the famous paradigm shift starts. I suggest the paradigm shift is inevitable. It is a must, definitely, it's imperative. But I think we should not wait to see all of these macro dynamics to change, because we can't overnight change political system. We can't overnight change economic system. All of these are actually in many ways interdependent, but the paradigm shift actually should start in examining our attitudes toward education. What do you mean by education? How do you perceive education? We have to realize, isn't it, as a kind of a meta analysis of how we perceive education as parents, as human beings, as also professionals, because our imagination of education implicitly actually determines the way in which we structure, develop policies of education. I would say paradigm shift should start by examining our attitudes towards education. And I think we will discover exactly what the Quran and its transformative educational vision has set out to do in 7th century Western Arabia. So we cannot read and develop new perspectives in Muslim philosophy if we do not have theoretical innovativeness, we do not question, explore. So we have to find a way to overcome this binary framing of educational issues, Islamic, Western, traditional, modern, religious, secular. This binary way of thinking is no longer doing us good. I understand that we need to decolonize educational space, but we should not be stuck into this hangover of colonial experience. Although it has been traumatic, it is real, but the fact is we need to find a new way of inspiration, confidence, to go beyond that psychology and open up our imagination to our tradition as well as the world we live in. And one way would be to recognize that the fact that educational analysis has to be contextual, interdependent, and intersectional. That is, there's no one dynamic, it touches everything. Educational discourse is made up of sub-discourses from religion, politics, economics, history, social class, gender, all the rest of it. So we have to understand our analysis of educational policy, innovativeness, should be contextual, interdependent, and intersectional. We have to realize that education, sadly, in our imagination, subconscious, is explicitly reduced to set of transmission activities, which are reproducing the same mentalities and, of course, same power relations. Therefore, justice remains an unrealized reality, sadly. So education space needs to be innovative and empowering. Particularly, we have to, in our reconstruction, think of the experiences of the 21st century learners, the so-called fourth industrial revolution, the Z generation or the new millennials. We cannot simply reconstruct an education abstract. It has to include experiences of the learners. Hence, it got to be inquiry-based, research-informed, community-embedded, transformative practice. This is what education is supposed to be. This is what universities are really for. Doesn't matter West or East. These qualities have got no permanent homeland. They belong to humanity, and whoever, I suppose, invest in them, they really create a new civilization. But final point is we need to rediscover the transformative features of education in Muslim tradition, because as we said, Islam has infused all of our psyche and culture, and we have to be able to reconnect with that transformative feature. So education process is not simply, it's inclusive of facts, yes, but also this facts has to accompany conceptual awareness. And most crucially, education should connect communities, individuals. This ability of connecting is an important human skill. And this connection could be spiritual, moral, emotional, and awareness. And of course, applied skills of doing things. So education facilitates interconnection of all of these dimensions to be able to produce active, creative learning. An ability to transfer knowledge and skills, all of these are telling us signs of deeper, higher order thinking, application of these skills. So educational process, regardless of content, could be science or could be humanities, it really needs to meet with these basic skills. So if you turn into a kind of a bit of a scientific framing, I would say if you think of education sciences in general, and I include Islamic education in this, it's because education sciences are applied fields and they really require interdisciplinary framing. But education science has an extra layer because it's an applied science, I would say, which is, I think, fits within, if you are aware, this famous Jürgen Habermas's typology of sciences. He comes up with these 3 generic domains of human interest because knowledge is produced about human interest. So the idea is whose interest is being served. If you look at the scientific research or field, we have natural sciences. They tell us how nature works. Social humanities, practical knowledge. But then he has a third category called emancipatory domain, liberating domain of sciences producing self-knowledge, self-reflection, hence transformation. And I think education sciences, and particularly Islamic education, should be a really liberating scientific endeavor, inquiry. And here some people will always ask, when I talk about these issues, they always say, this is all wonderful, but what is innovativeness? What is creativity? Really, can you be innovative within a highly sensitive religious Islamic context? So I just remind them, I say, look, when you look at literature on innovation and creativity, they all tell us certain criteria. For example, capacity to be able to connect, integrate ideas, knowledge, skills, and resources, to be able to have a felt concern, to challenge inertia, status quo, and with an empirical sort of observation, try to facilitate positive change, tell people why change is necessary, have evidence for requesting change, risk-taking, embracing complexity, and obviously examining cultural attitudes towards creativity. So you can see that innovation is really not an abstract, actually, concept. It's all to do with, just as we mentioned, qualities of a good education. A good education is really liberating, it is empowering, confidence building, but also is creating space for innovation, because if innovation is to be able to see, connect, find synergies, risk take, and of course bring something new to solve a problem, then what you are doing is really a good educational practice. So educational innovation should be at the forefront of these emancipatory Islamic educational sciences. And this is I'm getting now towards my final slides. Don't worry about this rather crowded PowerPoints. You'll have time to read them separately, inshallah. So my final point is, how do we become innovative? How do we become creative? Yes, we have to understand today's complexity. We need social science to help us to understand our reality, but also we need to reconnect with our tradition. This is the fundamental point of reconnecting with the Quranic transformative educational vision. We have no time to unpack this concept, but I have spent a lot of time actually looking at the theology of education in Islam. What is education in Islam, which should be really a concern to everybody who's interested in higher education in Muslim societies. So I could genuinely say, I don't have time to explain and provide evidence for this, the more you look at the Quran, the more you realize it's really actually a transformative educational book. That is very strange. It is actually a learner-centered book. Some people might simply, how come? It's from God, it's divine. But actually, if you engage with Quran educationally, pedagogically, you will not fail to discover the Quran is a human centered or learner centered book, because Quran's main preoccupation is how to transform human condition. And therefore, Quran has anthropology, Quran has a very complex pedagogic vocabulary, which I myself spend a lot of my time decoding it. What do we find this Quranic anthropology of educational pedagogic language? We have developmental dynamic vision of growth, change, nurture. You only have to think, those of you know Arabic, to make a link between the word Ar-Rabb, Rabbul Alameen, and Tarbiyah. These two concepts should easily, etymologically, will tell you that education in the Quran and Islam really is a dynamic process of growth, change, and nurture. It has relational, ethical, therapeutic sides because it has looking after, caring concept. It has a leadership focus because Rabb also means, if you take that particular concept, guide, to be lead. So every educationalist should be actually a natural leader if you follow the Quranic educational philosophy, basically. It is learner-led, as we said, empowered, because entire effort of the Quran is to listen and to respond in order to transform human condition. It's holistic, it integrates, it brings together devotional spiritual elements with critical reflective dimensions that are intertwined, gender inclusive, because the preoccupation is facilitating growth into humanity, not simply, as people assume, male or manliness. But most crucially, this individual preoccupation always has a teleological kind of an aim to bring about justice, prosperity. We can only look at the Quran, isn't it? The word Islah and Iflah. These two words are the key Quranic social justice concept as well as educational concept, because Islah means continual reform. Iflah means that reform should succeed. So a good Muslim is a prosperous muflih. It is someone who's able to actually succeed. So the kind of salvation, theologically, according to Quran, really, it is not a delayed salvation, as some people assume in the hereafter, but actually the Quran is insisting that we should have a realized salvation, because iflah means we are encouraged to succeed in this world. And the chances are, if we don't succeed in this world, that means we may, la samahallah, risk losing our akhirah too. So iflah is a key concept. That means a realized eschatology, a realized salvation. That means building, prospering Muslim communities. And this is an educational vision. And finally, of course, ultimately, the Quran wants to bring recognition, gratitude towards God. That is the shukr, hamd, isn't it? And that should reflect in all human actions. Of course, there will be some people who will not recognize God, and the Quran is very realistic about this. The Quran says, well, in that case, you have to respect those who are going to face the ethical consequences of their choice. So this is a crucial element in Islam. It's a kind of pre-modern liberal attitude, if you like, a liberational attitude that, you need to be tolerant to even somebody who's not going to recognize the manifest reality according to the Quran, al-haq, the truth. You have to understand, because human condition is complex. So gratitude is a key educational virtue, just like prosperity and justice. So cutting the long story short, if you just engage with the Quranic educational vocabulary, anthropological vocabulary, you end up with actually an educational imagination that is definitely not limited to mere transmission instruction, but it is a holistic, transformative process of human flourishing. And this is what is really missing component of why education does not succeed in Muslim societies. But good news, we have hope. It is not messianic, it is here and now. It's a realized salvation. We have a new century of transformative Islamic higher learning, inshallah. This is the UIIU that is based, I believe, on this transformative vision of education in Islam, and is going to hopefully share this with the rest of Islamic world as well as the whole humanity. I'm really excited to be part of this initiative. I hope what I've presented made sense to you, and I'm hoping to just stop here. We have references for you to follow up, but I will pass on these references to you later on to follow up, inshallah. So thank you for your attention. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين. I look forward to your questions and discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sahin, for your elaborative presentation. We have so many questions here, but I would like to firstly highlight some of your points, not to repeat what the whole presentations, like that you mentioned in the beginning about the encounter of Muslim with the Western secular education, but not many success. Actually, I would like to have like your more elaboration why this encounter with modernity is not successful, not many success. And then I do appreciate your highlighting about the gender gap. It is very sad that Muslim societies, I believe as a Muslim feminist, I argue for equality and justice, but unfortunately in reality, we still have gender gap in accessing education, and the data shows that only 4 out of 10 Muslim women have access to formal schooling. Okay. Okay, I'm afraid if I was out from the Zoom 3 times, so I'm glad that I'm still here. And you have already pointed out many problems that happening in Muslim societies, like the research quality is declining, not preparing youth, and then mismanagement of the rapid urbanization, and then environmental impact, gender injustice, and marginalization of human rights. And also in terms of the practice of education, we don't have the data of how Islamic studies operates, yeah, and then most of the program fall under the category of theology. So we are lack of empirical studies, yeah. We are being too normative in our educational system. And you also highlight that what is happening today is mostly like identity formation in the process of education, but actually what we need is exploratory type of identity, yeah. So here education must be a transformative force in the formation of early Muslims, and that's actually what I would like to know more about, the how to make like education to be a transformative force in the formation of early Muslims, yeah, because I think your attention is much on youth, because youth or the young age is a very crucial time, yeah. There are also, you highlight about the problems of education, and what we need to do as Muslims, like we need to examine our attitude toward education, and we need to have like theoretical innovation, and then to leave behind the binary attitude, yeah, toward education, yeah, because that's what's happening today. We tend to dichotomize Islamic, Western, tradition, modernity, yeah, and then you suggest to discover the contextual or intersectional characters, yeah, in all elements of the society, like politics, economy, yeah, and not reducing education into transmissions activities, yeah, but it should be like inquiry-based, research-informed, community-embedded transformative practice. So we need to rediscover transformative. So that's the transformative. The word transforms, the term of our seminar. You mentioned many times in your presentation, in order we can rediscover transformative feature of education in Muslim in Muslim tradition. Yeah. Okay. Okay. I think I need to read the. Okay, and last, I remember that you emphasized the importance of the Quran as a source book for our education, because it is humanistic approach, and then many good things in the Quranic verses, including that we need to be grateful to God, yeah, in our life, yeah. Okay, let me read the questions. There are 12 questions from the audience. First, maybe I will read one by one. The first question is from Panji Sudarmaji. Is it possible to unite the Islamic world politically? If not, what are the biggest obstacles in your opinion? Alternatively, is it possible to enlarge the organization of Islamic cooperation? So please, if you would like to answer that question.
Well, thank you. First of all, really good summary, Professor Nina. I really liked your summary of my key messages. Thank you for doing that. Obviously, theoretically, it is possible. This political unity idea. The fact is, we have a plural ummah. I think we should acknowledge that we have differences and diversity in political organization principles. I think this, in a sense, political unity should not mean some sort of convergence of the same type of governance models. This is just, it cannot work. Some people assume Islam has this kind of magical khilafah system that could bring everything back. But really, it's an imagined idea. It is not historically really true that actually this was like this, because even in the past, political unity always meant to have space for autonomous presence. It was symbolic and all the rest of it. So today, I think conditions that we are in are so complex. Just organizations like this Islamic, Organization of Islamic Cooperation is a good one. You could create voluntary organizations where you produce opportunities for exchange, collaboration. And I think education should be at the forefront, particularly universities. I would like to see Islamic world much more getting closer in terms of their higher education systems, where they can exchange research knowledge, outcome, share solutions, experiment with ideas. I am much more interested in integrated Islamic higher education systems cooperation, much really less, I would say, political, because political is a little bit messy stuff, and we don't need to waste our time to expect this kind of unity. But we need to encourage, and this historically, by the way, it's a reason as to why Islam became a civilization. Muslim ulama, scientists, even in the medieval ages, they had this rihla tradition, safar, this traveling stuff. So actually Muslims invented, I would say, this visiting fellowship framework that we have today at the universities. So they were creating these networks which were independent of whatever country they were coming from. And they were actually traveling from Baghdad to Nishapur, I don't know, to Java, to Aceh, so this kind of spirit of Islamic higher learning, to have learning communities always engage in exchange, was a crucial feature of Islamic higher education. I would say today, we need to create opportunities of bringing together, converging this Islamic scientists, Islamic knowledge producers, and UIII, I hope, should actually kind of prioritize this as it's one of its key mission, because that cooperation is what we need. It is educational creativity, innovation that's going to create solutions, hopefully to be shared across the ummah. I think we have kind of failed to do that. There isn't really knowledge exchange, connecting cultures. And I would like to see Islamic higher education doing that. And this is what today's Western universities do, by the way. Connecting knowledge, internationalization are the key dominant features of the top 10 universities in the world. So I would say, yes, political unity, we will like to see one day, definitely. We want Ummah reunified, but I think we need to create an educational infrastructure first, that actually fosters collaboration, exchange. So we kind of realize that we are all different, but we can still work together. But if you don't exchange, the chances are you will not really share solutions, share good practice. And of course, scientific creativity all depends on these communities of scientists being in collaboration. I would say, yes, we need to really first start with getting together, connecting Islamic higher education institutions and scientists first. Hope this answers the question.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so the emphasis now is not political unity, but collaboration, cooperation, knowledge exchange. So that's what we need to encourage. Before I read for the questions, I would like I would apologize for not mentioning Dr. Haidir Mualim, the Secretary of UIII. Sorry, I'm not mentioning you earlier for your coming. Thank you for your presence and support, of course. Okay, I will continue reading the question from QA. It is from Muhammad Wafa. To what extent 14th century Islamic doctrine and political Islam have contributed in the terms of lagging education and thought of the Islamic society behind? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, this is a good point. And our reference point is the great Maghribi scholar, isn't it, Ibn Khaldun? So Ibn Khaldun, isn't it, should be our key text, is Muqaddimah. It should be like, you know, what you have in Indonesia, you have Kitab Kuning, isn't it? These yellow books that all past-entrance students have to read. I would say Kitab Kuning should have Muqaddimat Ibn Khaldun as its essential text. Because Ibn Khaldun, 13th, 14th century, he analyzes in his time why Islamic civilization is beginning to decline. And he puts his finger on something very interesting. It's a very interesting book anyway. You know, it's a very weird book actually. It's a kind of out of the ordinary. It's a gharib book. But he actually, in pre-modern times, he critically reflects on why in his own time there's a decline. There's a lot of debate about decline, I don't know, stagnation. But the reality is Muslim scholars who reflected on Islamic knowledge systems, like Ibn Khaldun in his Muqaddimah, they realized there is something is going wrong. And it's very true. The decline actually predates Western colonialism. It starts all the way back. Although Muslims are politically maybe dominant still at that time, but internally, Islam is no longer able to regenerate itself. This observation belongs to Ibn Khaldun. It's nothing to do with anybody now today saying. So they can't say this is a modern reading, a liberal reading. Absolutely not. This is an observation enshrined in Muqaddimat Ibn Khaldun, which must be a key text for any students of Islam and also Islamic social sciences. It's a good point.
Okay, thank you. There are two questions from Aqsa Fatima from Pakistan. What role should our media play in portraying the positive side of Islam and Muslim? Because according to her, be educated is not enough until and unless we adopt the right strategy. So she would like to know what should she do as students in spreading the message that Islam is a peaceful religion and we Muslim are a peaceful nation.
Yeah,
okay,
that's a good point, isn't it? Yeah, yes. This is a good point. We talk about the fourth industrial revolution, digital. We have to capitalize. She is right, the sister. You know, we obviously have to be able to also communicate effectively Islamic message, Islamic civilization. That requires literacy in media studies, that requires literacy in journalism, that requires literacy in digital social media expertise. Obviously, we are aware of the fact that sadly now we know social media could unfortunately corrupt the truth. Sadly, this is a reality. It's a big danger to democracy, in fact. But I agree that yes, you know, media is so important. It is the key figure of this fourth revolution, where we need to really have space for, particularly media studies, journalism. We need really creative articulation of effective ways of communicating Islamic values to diverse audiences, because we are living in an interdependent world. You know, West doesn't really know much, for example, In fact, even Muslim societies have got prejudice against one another. So what we need is a genuinely forceful, clear media platform where these prejudices are dispelled and obviously Islamic message is communicated. So we do need, yes, definitely a digital media presence, strong presence to be able to effectively communicate. And that is also media education and digital education, very, very much needed.
Okay, thank you. And we will proceed to another question from Supriyono. He is a prospective student who will start studying in this university in September. So he would like to ask if we have enough data to compare Islam to other religions, not just Western countries, in transforming their respective religious societies in this modern world. So is Islam really lag behind the other religion in this aspect?
I couldn't quite get that question from who?
Pardon?
I couldn't quite catch that question.
Okay, so he would like to know the comparison between Islam and other religions to know or to make sure whether Islam is lag behind other religions. So what we have discussed is about Muslim societies and Western societies, but he would like to know the comparison between Muslims and other followers of religions, whether Muslims are really lag behind other religions or not.
That's a good question. Yes, yeah, of course. Religion does make a difference. I think for this, I really recommend, which I did mention, the Pew Research Center website. Actually, they have conducted research since 2005 onwards to look at access to education across Muslim and non-Muslim populations. You know, in some areas, Muslims are high, some areas, other religious members are high. So this is an empirical question, and there's actually a very good data source, the Pew Research Center. I really advise for this questionnaire to look at that. There are differences depending on Muslim societies, but we have now data telling us how this is acting out in terms of the function of being a member of a religious community and accessing education, or gender, for example. But I know for a fact that gender remains a problem within the Muslim populations across minority and majority contexts, sadly. In this, Muslims are not really doing well compared to other members of other religions. But again, depends on the society, and we have data. So I really welcome these people to look at Pew Research Center's website, which is free to look at, inshallah.
Okay, another question is from anonymous attendee, so I cannot mention the name. The person asked the question about, given the weakness of university education in the Islamic world, do you think that this weakness is the result of political corruption or the lack of community awareness?
Well, all of these have contribution, as we just analyzed. These are macro level dynamics. True, of course, politics, as we said, it is the highest organizing principle of our societies. So we like or we don't like, we have to understand, isn't it, how politics frames educational discourse, how it includes or excludes. It has, of course, if it is corrupt, sadly, that will have a big impact on how education and functions. So the politics of education, isn't it, is an inevitable dynamic we have to bear in mind. But it's difficult to pin down who is what. But certainly it is a big factor that educational analysis should bear in mind, which, as I did in the beginning. But it is not reduced to the political dynamic, by the way. In educational, I suppose educational stagnation and educational decline, it is linked with political dynamics, but it is not simply, again, remember intersectionality, which is our guiding methodic principle. You know, education is to do with human societies, all interdependent. It is not simply a matter of resources either. You might have resources, but if you don't have the vision, there's no way you can rectify. What is missing, I would say, is this inculcating, fostering, inquiring, questioning educational culture. I think the bottom line is You could have excellent politics, you could have excellent resources, but if you don't have an educational culture that encourages reflection, inquiry, questioning, the chances are it will not succeed. We've seen the reports about the science education. Muslim world spends more money onto science education than anything else in terms of education, social science, humanities. But now these experts in science education are telling us, actually, it is not working. We also have data about American Western type universities cloned in Islamic world, particularly in the Gulf. American University of this and that, for example, Australian University of this and that. These kind of experiments are really not recognizing the contextual challenge, the educational culture. So even they are not functioning despite huge investment, despite huge transfer of a high educational culture from Stanford to MIT, for example, but expecting that this will produce the same caliber of students in a Muslim society is just delusional. That means, it will not work. So the question of politics, resources, cloning, I don't know, Harvard in an Islamic university society, I don't think it will work. There's no evidence it will work. Absolutely not. Even in sciences, it's not working. In fact, they are telling us science, in order to succeed science education, we need to have very good Islamic humanities first. Students must understand how to question, how to engage with problems, how to think, for example. This is Islamic liberal arts. This is Islamic humanities topic. If you don't have this infrastructure, you will have a transmission model in science education. So my problem is, and my focus has always been, how do we make changes in this very micro level perception of education and educational culture? You can only do this if you change people's perception. Learners, teachers, education policy makers, civil society members. This is the da'wah. This is the pedagogic da'wah. We have to really kind of make people think exactly like what the Quran did. Imagine Quran was revealed 7th century Arabia, not very literate community, no reading and writing. The Quran spends 13 years inculcating a culture of question, reflection, thinking. Why? Because if you don't have people reflecting and thinking, the chances are they won't change. So today we have cognitive psychologists are telling us the same thing. They're saying, look, if you have a phobia, right, you got to have a cognitive therapy. What does it mean, cognitive therapy? That means you begin to change your perception, your thinking of the phobia that you have. If you change that thinking, the chances are you will be transforming. Here is the magic word of transforming stuff. So I would say what we need to do, regardless of traditional, non-traditional, secular, liberal, we need to have an educational platform, educational culture that encourages question, reflection, inquiry. This is the magic, honestly. Whoever does that, they produce great scientists, Nobel laureates. If they don't, the chances are cloning MIT, Harvard will not produce laureates, I don't know, the achievers. So our perception of what education is, how we imagine, an educational culture that sustains research, sustains inquiry. Key ingredient. It never fails. 7th century Arabia didn't fail. It will not fail us 21st century. But we have to get that educational culture gradually built. And Islamic higher learning, its task is to do that, exactly to do that. If you don't do this, really, we cannot succeed.
Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you very much. Yeah, okay. I like your emphasis of the referring back into the Quran, because I remember one of the Quranic verse which encourage change to transform, that in Allah la yughayyiru ma bi anfusihim, in Allah la yughayyiru ma bi qawmin hatta yughayyiru ma bi anfusihim. So I like the reference to the Quran. Yeah. There are still more questions I would like to read. For example, the question from Trevor. The person give compliment, interesting presentation. The concept of the interdisciplinary is very useful in breaking traditional silos. But what are some of the practical steps that can be taken to achieve this? So the person want the elaboration about the practical step that can be taken to achieve the interdisciplinary, the concept of trans-interdisciplinary.
That's right. So we have to have expertise from psychology, politics, sociology, to bear in mind in our analysis of education problems. So education, by definition, is an interdisciplinary field. It's an applied field. Some people even claim there's a difference between education sciences and educational sciences. There's a debate going on. I have written about this. You can look at some of my articles. So education sciences is to do with understanding how education operates. And for this, you got to have sociology, politics, social science, international relations. So we need to encourage expertise from these disciplines to have bearing upon educational decision-making. Now, another practical step would be how do you bring change is utilizing research. So without research awareness, obviously this expertise will not work. So I recommend what we call action research to be mandated to all of the professional development courses in Islamic world. Because action research is very simple. It says we have to skill practitioners with a research set of skills to monitor their practice, identify strengths and weaknesses, and then introduce interventions, and then assess this intervention. As simple as this. I would say educational research really should follow this action research, and it's a very practical way of making an intervention and change. So action research is my second recommendation. If anybody is interested in introducing any innovativeness or any change or beginning to transform. So we need to really teach, and I'm sure that the UIII would have significant investment in educational research infrastructure building. This has to be transdisciplinary, but it also has to have an applied research skills disseminated, hopefully, to its students.
Okay, I like your suggestion about doing action research because I am in the Faculty of Education. We have suggested the teachers to do classroom action research, and what you have suggested is like to monitor the practice, evaluate the strengths and weaknesses, and then introduce interventions. That's simple, but it is a way to make the change in our society. It is very transformative. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, we still have half an hour to go, and we have still many questions. Let me read further questions. It is from Professor Asfa Widianto. Thank you very much for coming, Professor Asfa Widianto. I would like to read your question. Many thanks for Professor Sahin for your enlightening presentation. Muslims have been concerned with knowledge for living, while the Western world has been concerned with knowledge for power. Do you see any potential Muslim country or education institution which might serve as a model in transforming education so as to develop a better knowledge culture? So that's the question.
Well, I mean, this is a bit of an unfair question, really. I mean, how could I pick and choose one institution? Obviously, you know, I'm originally from Turkey. I would say, well, actually, no, the Turkish higher education is quite brilliant. I know that Professor Kamaruddin spent some time, got some inspiration from Turkey. I could say maybe the best universities are there, but it is difficult, really. As I said, overall, despite these pockets of model practices, innovative practices, we haven't quite made that a good practice disseminated to become a force for change. So of course, in these universities, there are creative scholars who work on different aspects of Islamic, thought, Islamic economics, Islamic whatever. But the problem is, as a overall, Islamic higher education doesn't seem to be producing quality outcome. This is the problem. Otherwise, we have pockets of creative models across Islamic universities. These are both generic universities and also Islamic universities. I mean, obviously, we can assess, for example, the 1977 onwards, the first Mecca conference, and the subsequent universities. We have at least 5 or 6 universities, and they have made an explicit attempt to write on curricular reform, teaching methods, pedagogies. We can actually assess, we can say, okay, what was the outcome of that experiment? You remember the kind of thesis they had, this Islamization of knowledge. Nobody talks about it today. Nobody wants to talk about it. But that used to be quite fashionable stuff for nearly 3 decades. What happened? So obviously, we have to adopt a rigorous research to understand the weaknesses and strengths. This is what is missing. I would say we need to conduct research to learn from these experiences, but also to pinpoint what worked, what didn't work, and why. Why still Islamic higher education doesn't count even 0.1% of knowledge production in the world? Why we are still not making into the type 100 universities in the world? I mean, we don't want to take the ranks as criteria, but the reality is these ranks are based on student experience, creative knowledge output, research output. Well, decades of investment in education, secular or Islamic, but we can't make it to. What is it that? What is the problem in here? Why is it that we don't have, for example, educational philosophers? You see, people always go into science, and Islamic science is always going to fiqh and tafsir and kalam, with all due respect. But they don't realize actually the heart of is all this education, transformative education. Why is it that we haven't quite produced educational philosophers? See, if we don't problematize education, if we don't experiment with new ideas, i.e., if we don't be creative theoretically, philosophically, if you like, we can't really have new products. So sadly, the situation is really, as I said, is quite daunting and not very encouraging. It's very negative, but that negativity is not meant to be making us feel bad about ourselves and feel like victim. No, on the other side, it should motivate us to search for new models. And I believe UIIU is outcome of such search, which, you know, it's a new initiative. It's a new confident, bold step to kind of gear change in Islamic higher education in the modern world, which is fine. We should be experimenting. Remember the innovativeness, one criteria, risk-taking. Obviously, I hope, you know, that risk is going to pay off, but without risk-taking, we can't be really creative. And without having new education ideas, we can't change the thinking about education. So we will turn out, read the same text, same ideas. So the danger of transmission, by the way, don't forget, transmission is a very good concept. You pass on knowledge. But if you only pass on knowledge, that means you are not changing the learner and the environment. So we have to find a way of re-engaging, rethinking what is education. So we have to encourage young people to take up philosophy of education as a field, as well as empirical research. You know, they go hand in hand. We need to encourage this creative thinking so young people could have a chance to come up with different. They might come maybe worse ideas, but you've got to risk take. At least one will be good. I mean, I forgot to tell you, I think it's in my references. Again, I go back to, because education is all about really how you create individual change. Today we know, because of the neuroscience, in fact, nearly 90% of actual human creativity comes from emotional intelligence. So in other words, we used to assume, you know, intellectual cognitive thinking is the key in the brain, but actually it's the other way around. The brain, human brain, doesn't have cognitive, emotional separate. They bring together. So we need to inculcate this kind of readiness, you know, in a very early on, from nursery to, you know, pre-cognitive level, so that the emotional intelligence builds up this confidence, the spirit, so that, you know, people could come with creativity. So we should really invest even in emotional intelligence to be able to foster this creative, transformative educational culture we need. So we got to have researchers, philosophically, psychologically, sociologically, engaging with this question of education. What is going on with the Islamic world? Why is it not transforming? How could we arrange this? What are the new ideas?
Okay, thank you very much for your suggestion. Do empirical research, experiment with new ideas, be brave to take a risk. That's the way, that's some of the ways to be change and transform the society and to be creative. Okay, let me read further question. This is from Hazrat Shah Kayan. I think he is one of the new students in the Faculty of Education. Very short, but I think need elaboration. How can the holistic transformation be bring to practice?
Yeah, I think we've kind of answered that question as well. You know, what we have said, it is the gap between the theoretical and the practical sort of process, which is research is the key, really. The action research we mentioned is to gain skills for creative, reflective thinking, but also empirical research skills to be able to say, let's build an evidence base for our intervention first. Remember, innovation is difficult. Why? Because people will say, oh, it is too risky, we cannot do it. But if you have evidence to say, look, our education, our primary school, I don't know, is producing foreclosed minds. I've got evidence. I've done this research questionnaire. Here are the results. When parents see this, they say, okay, I don't want my child to be foreclosed. I want my child to be courageous, exploratory. So in other words, research is the key, i.e. evidence building, and then making suggestions to the stakeholders to basically buy into what you are proposing. So in other words, you can't simply be prophetic, I want to just change things like this. It's no longer we have individuals like that. The best way would be to build empirical basis for a problem and then say, look, we have evidence for this. Now we need to find a way to resolve this. This kind of experiential epistemology is missing in today's Islamic thought. We are just, I like this investment in the history of Islamic intellectual thought. But this like archaeology. We are doing a lot of archaeology of past people, dead people, and their texts. It's an interesting idea, to learn about Imam Ghazali and what he has written. But to be able to actually replicate Imam Ghazali's educational vision, philosophy, is difficult. So we spend a lot of time studying the text, but less are inspired to do exactly what Imam Ghazali did. That is, engage with philosophy, empirical sciences, theology, and create an integrated model. Hence, of course, we don't produce people at the caliber of Imam Ghazali. So in other words, we need to integrate. Remember, another way of innovation is capacity to integrate. If our education system is not enabling this skills integration across conceptual awareness, applied skills, research skills, the chances are this transformation, i.e. sustained change in the form of something, will not come about.
Okay, thank you. Let me read the question from Imam Kanafi. Professor Abdullah Sahin, why doesn't Islamic science have power on the global level? What is wrong with Islamic science so far? Are not there many Muslim scientists who have studied with Western civilizations? And I think I will read one more question related to that question. It is about the Nobel Prize. Okay. Is there any Nobel Prize like awards in the Muslim world? Do Muslims try to get the Nobel Prize? So that's the question.
I think we've kind of answered these questions. I don't want to like rankings, Nobel Prize winning, not a really criteria, but it is an outcome. We do have maybe a couple of people, I believe, beginning with the very famous physicist from Pakistan, isn't it? Our very first Nobel laureate. But we should aim at Nobel laureate in other fields, in humanities, in poetry, in our cultural heritage. So science, privileging science, it's really a bit of a danger. We do need science, of course. Whether there is something called Islamic science or not is a separate question. We don't have time to debate this. But science education, as I've just cited, this report, 2015 report, is a good report to look at. See, I think there are at least Asia-Pacific countries, there are North African, and there's more or less global Islamic universities are analyzed for science education. The results are not encouraging. The people at the forefront of science education are telling us we really need to have good humanities first, social sciences first, because our scientists are becoming like technicians. They're not becoming creative. they are good in using instruments and lab, but then really not creative, coming up with new ideas. So I would say the issue again in science goes back to, sadly, a poor educational infrastructure. And we need to build this across Islamic world. So it would be nice to have Nobel laureate, of course, nobody says no, but that shouldn't make us negative. We should keep trying. We are not working to be producing new knowledge because we just want to have this recognition. No, we want to transform the poverty, the life expectancy, the quality of life, well-being, peace, get rid of the tension that we are suffering from. We have so much complicated problems in our societies that we need education to be a response. I don't think politics, resources are the only sources. Education is the long, sustainable, actually, problem-solving institution that we need to revive, make it active. If Islamic societies could manage that, I am sure even politics will change.
Okay. In Islamic education method, there is a method which is called targhib wa tarhib. The targhib is the encouragement to do a good work, giving the reward. Might be the person who asks the question want to like having the encouragement to produce much by giving the award. Okay.
That's
let's
right.
Let's me continue to read Dian Sinta Pertiwi question. Talking about education, I personally cannot stop thinking about the root of individual's education, which lies in the phase of early childhood. So she would like to ask, could you please share your insights about what parents and teachers can actually do, both at home and school, to transform the education systems or methods, despite the existing problem that any countries or background have? Thank you.
Yeah, this is a very good question, because educational culture cannot change unless at the family, at home, we make change. We make parents interested in the education of their children, and we hopefully make parents not only at home, but also be involved with the school, with the university, whatever they're doing. So this parental involvement with education is a really key. Remember we said inculcating these values of emotional values, attitudinal values. Actually, young people gain this more at home than at their formal university or a formal school. So therefore, home, this interaction at home subconsciously already orients young people. And I don't want to cite, there are many studies, psychologists they have done to prove how, given the equal IQ of children, when they follow up their success later on or failures in life, parental investment comes up as a strong element, variable, determining their success or failure. So you could have a child IQ of high IQ, similar IQ, but if you don't have a parental interest in education, chances are that individual appears to be not successful later on. These are empirical studies. So the value of culture in educational success is undeniable. This is a fact. How do we make parents to be interested in education of their children is the first principle. And as you know, of course, in Islam, this starts very early on at family. So even showing interest, we don't expect all parents to be scholars, experts on this and that. No, not like this. It is this whole attitude of valuing learning, listening to questions, that really builds children's resilience. And we have educational psychologists actually telling all about this, the importance of this. So I would say this nurture is the key, the first starting point of orienting children to have positive attitudes towards learning, newness. And that really can only start if we have a educational policy towards parents, more than really children. And this is a topic we can spend days talking about it, but it is a crucial aspect of getting this transformative education in place. Starts with parents and home, and parents should have awareness of what they do at home actually has an impact already on children's readiness to learn or not to learn, sadly. before even they come to teach. So thank you for that really good question. Yeah, it's a good question.
We have like about 10 minutes left, and I will read another 3 questions. First from Sabur, why some Muslims do not believe in the Quran and they do anything opposite the Quran, especially some immigrants from Afghanistan, Iran, Pakistan, and some other countries. What is the solution? How can we prevent them? Thank you. I don't know which country the person come from. Or would you like to answer that question?
What was the question? Why Muslims don't read the Quran?
Do not believe in the Quran and they do anything opposite the Quran. Why do some Muslims do not believe in the Quran and they do anything opposite the Quran?
Well, this applies to all of us, by the way. You know, as I mentioned, this is the cognitive dissonance that we are suffering from. You know, we have a book, Quran, embodiment of transformative education. Why we fail as Muslims to be inspired by it? You know, this is a basic question. The way in which we perceive the Quran is a problem. As I said, it's attitude, because we have built these kind of blockages. We're unable to hear the dynamic voice of the Quran. You see, we got layers and layers to go through. So, I mean, I can give examples from myself. I was trained in Islamic classical sciences. You know, I never looked at the Quran educationally. I always thought the Quran is tafsir. I should do exegesis. I should do hermeneutics, ta'wil, and then I become interested in the law. How do we discern law? What is illah? What is hikmah? When you look at the verses, it is only when I came to UK and I began to look at Muslim young people, how they learn Islam, I realized my engagement with the Quran has always been like legal, you know, very formal. You know, I didn't realize Quran is actually first and foremost an educational book. Secondarily, it is a law book, it is a spiritual book, this and that. So the problem is we need to make a shift, as I said, paradigm shift, the way in which we kind of re-familiarize ourselves with the Quran. I call this an educational reading of the Quran is crucial. Only if you study educational sciences, this is what I want to give some credence to the educational scientists, not sociologists, psychologists, philosophers. When you look at the educational sciences and you learn what is education innovation, what is educational transformation, you then appreciate the Quranic educational vocabulary, right? So we all read Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Rabbul Alameen. It never occurred to me that Rabb actually goes back all the way to Tarbiyah, the transformative education. A simple discovery. We have to shift our young people's attitudes to the Quran. They look at either like do's and don'ts, simply halal haram, or ideological, kafir, non-kafir, build boundaries. They never look at the Quran as actually, as the Quran says, hudan wa rahmatan lil alameen. It is guidance. What is guidance? That means iflah, to facilitate you to grow into humanity, be prosperous, and be successful, be peaceful. This is the fundamental Quranic educational vision. So I would say, really, this is a big problem. It's an educational challenge. It requires re-education, if you like. So you might spend 6 years of studying Sharia, but you might not at all understand the transformative Islamic education in the Quran. As simple as this. So it is a generic problem. Therefore, I said the micro level shift is required, change. We have to, sometimes phenomenologists call this, you have to kind of bracket out. There's a technique, they call it epoch in phenomenologists. To be able to understand the phenomena objectively, you should step back, isn't it? And you should a little bit be open to what you are observing. So when you observe that objectively, you can understand properly. Otherwise, you may have prejudices. So this kind of defamiliarizing, refamiliarizing us with the Quran is the key. So our young people, of course, are afraid of the Quran. Is it all rules? Is it all to the do's and don'ts? What else is in the Quran? So the way we give Quran literacy is a problem. sadly. And this is a major, major task. We need to create a reflective Quran literacy, Islam literacy, Hadith literacy, if you like it. And that begins with slightly shifting the change to look at the educational reading of the Quran. I am very passionate about the Quran because hopefully my second book is all about this Quran and how do we create this literacy, reflective literacy of the Quran. And it is amazing when you look at the Quran like that. So it is a generic problem, but we need to make that shift of being prepared to look at the Quran educationally. And this is where we can discover really new insights, transformative insights. And that is crucial for all Muslim communities, regardless of following or not following, practicing, not practicing Muslim. It's irrelevant, because these are social problems we are all sharing the burden. But if you reconnect with a transformative vision of education, the chances are we will become better human beings for a start. Anyway, so
thank you very much for your answer, Sabul. So this is not only the problems of among some immigrants from Afghanistan, Iran, Pakistan, but this is our problems, not to find the Quran as educational source, because mostly people refer to the Quran as the source of Islamic law only, but you have already found that this is the source for education. Okay, let me read the last question. I'm sorry for those whose question cannot be read and answers because of the time. Okay, this is the question is how to effectively apply the Quranic transformative educational concept to our modern curriculum, in particular studies. I believe if university can successfully apply this to their curriculum, the taqlid or the messiah educational belief will eventually erase within the development of Muslim students framework, critical thinking, confidence, etc. Okay, would you like to answer that question?
Yeah, very good point. Very good point. I think now we can experiment how to integrate some of these ideas, this creative transformative education, when we reform curriculum. You see, people talk about curriculum reform in Islamic world. What they do, they just simply cut and paste, copy some fancy thing from European or American countries. This is not really a curriculum reform, right? Curriculum reform means, isn't it? Curriculum requires educational vision. Educational vision requires value statements that make sense to you. So I would say some of these ideas that I was experimenting are actually conceptual basis for rethinking curriculum, particularly pedagogy, the way in which we facilitate learning and teaching. Therefore, the subtitle of my book is really poignant. It says identity formation and pedagogic practice. So definitely we need such conceptually challenging new ideas with which to actually reform curriculum and teaching methods. One of the reasons, for example, why Islamization of knowledge appears to have failed, because it appears none of the involved people were educationally literate. This is a big claim, but this is true. None were actually trained in Islamic sciences or educational sciences. That was a big drawback. They may have been philosophers or physicists or scientists, but they were not educationalists. This curriculum reform requires expertise from different sciences, but at the core, we got to have educational science experts. You got to have Islamic core sources experts. And therefore, without new educational philosophy conceptual basis, the changes recommended were very premature. And of course, there were almost no empirical research, sadly. The third point was that they did not conduct any empirical research to experiment how this renewed curriculum could work or not work. So you can't, for example, look at textbooks. People produce textbooks with committees, right? Committee A produce a book on Sirah. Committee B produce, on Quran. They sit in a room and then write a textbook. This is not how you produce interactive teaching resources, right? Quranic literacy, you can't write wonderful, excellent book. It will be like full of information about the ulum al-Quran, but it wouldn't tell us whether this textbook will work with, 8-year or 10-year grade students, For this, you got to have a research base. That committee should have a research subcommittee, should go and experiment with 6 months with an actual classroom, with actual students, to experiment whether the teaching methods of the Quran are working or not. In other words, you got to have inclusion of learners' experiences when you develop a curriculum, a teaching book. This is missing. Hence, of course, you could always talk about curriculum reform, you could have fancy international conferences, but the results will not give us products are based on actual learner experiences. It will be like an armchair exercise, and therefore it doesn't work. So I think this curriculum reform, pedagogical reform, advancing science, advancing education in Muslim communities are fancy ideas, but people less are prepared to see how do we actually bring about products that actually make change. And the key thing is the connection of this empirical reality with the theoretical conceptual innovativeness. And I would say this is where we are now. We need this empirically informed textbook, curricula, policy development. And that is a key missing element. None of the Islamic higher education institutions I know that are teaching Islamic education are doing this stuff, sadly. And that includes science curriculum, by the way. They produce science curriculum based on, I don't know, English or French or whatever models. They don't say, look, how this science education will work in Indonesia or, I don't know, in Turkey or in Morocco. No interest. Well, if you don't have that experimental base, the chances are children would simply memorize and pass the exams, and that's it. And the reform will not produce. Hence, education that produced contemporary Europe, contemporary West, creative dynamic will be not achieved in the Islamic world, sadly.
Okay. Thank you very much for your energetic and elaborative presentation and lectures. Let me highlight some of the points that you have made. I don't mean to conclude everything, but the first point is that refer to the Quran as educational source or reference. And the second point is that explore your surroundings, evaluate the strength and weaknesses, and give suggestion to improve the situation. Then you can transform your society. Okay, let's make this lecture, it's almost 2 hours now, as an appetizer to learn further about the works and the thinking of Professor Abdullah Sahin by joining the UIII as a master or later PhD students or reader of his books. And I'm very glad that this webinar today has been attended by attendants from many different countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, and many more countries, of course, Indonesia. I would like to thank you all, especially for you as a wonderful speaker, and then also for director, vice rectors. And now I will give the time to Fahrul as the master of ceremony. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Professor Nina Nurmila, for having chaired this webinar session. Again, our gratitude should go to Professor Abdullah Sahin for his impeccable presentation. Before this webinar ends, we would like to invite other panelists attending this webinar to join for a photo session. Could the host? I will count to the count of 3 in order for the host of this webinar to take a picture of all the panelists available at this moment. Okay. 1, 2, 3. That's enough. Okay. We also appreciate all participants for attending this webinar, from the critical questions given to us and the lovely comments left in the chat box. Thank you, everyone. See you in the next webinar. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you, Abdullah.
Thank you, Abdullah Sahin. Thank you.
Pleasure.
See you soon.
Excellent lecture.
Thank you, Abdullah Sahin.
Great lecture. Very,
Hope it was useful, brother Fuad.
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you
care.
very
Take care,
much.
Fuad. Yes,
Thank you very much.
Thank
I hope
you.
you're well, inshallah, brother Fuad.
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Miss your
Thank
nice
you.
conversations.
Yeah, we
Thank
continue.
you.
Thank you,
Inshallah.
Professor Abdullahi.